So we'll kick this off and we'll have the panelists introduce themselves. The thing I'm excited about this panel, the one yesterday was more technical. This one's going to be more focused with the business mindset. These people have gone through executive and director meat grinder roles where they've had to answer to the business. And I think for many of you, you'll appreciate that because ultimately you have to answer the business too. So I'll kick it off to Kamesh and feel free to spend a few minutes. I really want them to appreciate your experience, and then we'll dive into questions.
Cool. Perfect. Hey guys, hopefully everyone can hear me well. I'm Kamesh, I'm the co-founder and CEO of Axern. Started a company about 10 years ago, so it's been a while, lots of ups and downs. We raised about 40 million plus in VC funding so far. And essentially what we do is we basically train classification models for financial services. These are different types of models that you can apply on top of any type of unstructured data. So let's say you have email, news articles, social media. These models, we can identify what are all the publicly traded companies being mentioned within a piece of news article. And even if that company isn't being mentioned, we can identify if a brand of that company is being mentioned or a product or a subsidiary or a supplier. And we can start linking these things together in an automated fashion. So these are classification models that we have built, and we have been selling this to asset managers, some of the largest quant funds. We sold it to banks, insurance companies, and so forth. And a little of how we got started, it's an interesting founder journey where it was just me and my co-founder in my basement in Queens, New York, like 10 years ago. My co-founder did his PhD at NYU in machine learning and computer science. And we kind of built the website in such a way that it felt like it was a real company. And the largest hedge fund in New York came to our website. He hit us up. He was like, hey, we love the idea. Can we get a trial of the product? We didn't build the product at all. We had no idea how to build the product. So the fund manager was extremely supportive of startup and founders. He was like, all right, let's get into my office the next day. I will give you a blueprint or a roadmap of what you should build for us. And so we went to the office the next day. We basically had a bunch of conversation with our analysts, and we started going and executing. And we were like, all right, where are we going to find like a VP of engineer and all these different things, because we got to build out data feed, we got to build models. It was just a massive scrap of a journey. And fast forward 6 months after, we built the product, what they were looking for. They tried it out. They became our first paying customer with and they give us a check. It was the most money I've ever seen in my life. And we basically took that cash, we invested it, and we went to the same exact type of customer and repeated it over and over and over again. And that's kind of how we started. So, yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Which fund was that?
It was Millennium Partners.
Oh,
yeah.
I used to work at a hedge fund.
Oh, no way.
So I'm Thomas Robinson. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Domino Data Lab. I'll tell you a bit about Domino in a second. For me, my background, I was a technologist for about 10 years working in a large hedge fund, doing all that alternative data stuff. Got out of that, did people management for a while, and now run all of our go-to-market at Domino. What does Domino do? We make a data science and AI platform for the world's largest enterprises who have models and AI and data science at the core of their business. So primarily financial services companies, banks, insurance companies, work with 10 of the world's 20 largest global pharma companies, to help with drug development, clinical trials, that sort of thing. And then public sector and DoD, everything from unmanned underwater vehicles detecting mines in the AUKUS region to tanks that need to target threats in the Middle East and other places. So variety of different things. I think what's, I hope, unique about my perspective, you mentioned business leaders. We work with people who can't sort of dick around with AI. We work with people who have their business running on models. They have millions, trillions of dollars rolling through their models on a day-to-day basis. They're beholden to regulators. They're beholden to the risk functions in their organizations, and they're beholden to the public perception of their brands. You know, our take is you have to be robust. You have to put science and all the expertise of many years of statistics and operational research and statistical computing and all that behind your models, and that the new AI thing is yet another wonderful tool in the belt. But when it comes to building AI into organizations, it has to be beholden to real business need at the end of the day. So it's a little bit about me.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
Hey everybody, my name's Nick King. So I got a bit of a funny story. I started off in New Zealand, as you can tell by the accent, and was building stuff and accidentally replatformed a mainframe to Windows boxes, and Microsoft's like, hey, no one's ever done that before. Do you want to come up to Redmond? So I moved to Redmond, worked on what became Azure, V1 and V2, and then I was working on SQL in this team. Google was starting to build Dremel, which became BigQuery. And at the time, Steve Ballmer was leaving, and so I met the Google guys like, oh, we're gonna release this product called BigQuery. Do you wanna come work on that? So I did that. And I worked on a bunch of stuff in Android, and fast forward a few years, I kind of got this reputation for rebuilding platforms and taking them to market. Dremel, all these have interesting stories from Android security, VMware's platform. And the last few years I've worked with Data Robot, some other companies I can't name, which you probably know, and really focusing on how do you do that large transformation. Since then, I recognized that there was a lot of shifts in the way that the world looked at AI. We all sort of look at AI as this, like, it's gonna solve all our problems. But if you think about it, most people can't really describe their problems that well, or they can't describe the data that well. Turns out you have to do those two things first before you even know how to apply AI. And then the second thing is we often build AI for insights, but what's the point of an insight? An insight's really about making a decision. So if you think about it, we're really building these insights to empower decisions. So how do you measure the value of a decision? How do you take an action from that? So about 2-3 years ago, we had a thesis that if we could find a way to analyze decisions and the implicit as well as explicit components of the data, we'd start to build these models which were much more accurate. Today, we'd call that agentic frameworks or declarative AI, where you effectively declare what is the result, what does the modality look like, and go and get that understanding. And that started off what became Data Kinetic. Today, most of our time is spent, probably in healthcare is about 70%, not for trying in financial services, oil and gas, defense, a bunch of other industries. But what I find with healthcare is that if we do something that makes something better, people are pretty grateful. If I go to a financial services person and say, hey, I just showed your hedge fund how to make more money and save some drawdown, they're like, how'd you do that? You're probably wrong. And so as a small company, what we realized is like, let's go about finding places where we can sell fast and really make an impact. So I hope to bring a couple perspectives today. One is, still coding, still very deep in the technology. And on the other side, have been through a number of business transformations. And those are hard. And knowing where to move the organization, how to get the organization to believe in those things, and even how to assess, like, is this the right thing and now, are all pretty critical. And so I hope to bring some of that, and pretty happy to be amongst some great people. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, awesome. Great to meet you, Nick.
Yeah.
Hey, folks. Alec Liskov. I'm a director of product at Intuit. I oversee MailChimp, anything that has to do with data and AI. I also oversee the data platform across our small business group, as well as all of the kind of analytics initiatives. Only 4 months at Intuit, and prior to that, I was at Verizon for a number of years. Much like I was actually a very happy customer of Domino Data Lab. Much like some of what Thomas mentioned, the work at Verizon was really around building a transformational journey from using data as sort of an analytics tool to being an operational tool, and really AI being the operational tool of choice for making a lot of decisions across the business. So we established and built an AI and data organization for the entire company. And we worked very closely with all the business partners to essentially embed AI into their operations, which is, I'm sure all of you know, it's really not about the technology, it's about the people. So a lot of experience in terms of how do you lead with technology, but really ultimately land with people and get to outcomes and kind of manage through that transformation for a large organization. One of the most kind of impactful areas where we were able to generate, and we're kind of on track to generate hundreds of millions of dollars for Verizon, the work that we did was in the marketing space. And that's when Intuit gave me a call and said, hey, we're starting to be a lot more serious about growth, business growth, not just bookkeeping. We want to start building tools and platforms that really help small and medium-sized businesses grow. And that, of course, includes marketing and sales. And so that's really what I'm doing today at Intuit. My background is data science, and I've always been in data and AI. I've done everything under the sun. I've done data analysis, architecture. I've done a lot of consulting, but happy to be here. Hope to add some perspectives.
Yeah. Well, as you see, we got a great panel. And I think one of the things I'm proud about is oftentimes when you have a course like this, it can be disconnected from applied. And the motivation is we want to bring people in that are literally cutting their teeth the moment before they walk in the door. And maybe before I kick off the first round of questions, Nick King actually used to be my boss at Data Robot. And he was my favorite executive, and he was one of his favorite direct reports.
Still up there.
It was still up there.
Should I tell them some of the rules we had? Of like,
Oh, yeah.
boy.
We had two rules. One was you can invest anything you want in a project. And Gibson had some crazy ideas. And I was like, you can invest whatever you want as long as it brings a return of at least 5x. And so he being a data science engineer, he was like, okay, I get that. The second one was don't get arrested. And this is a bit of an interesting story. We were working with a government agency around fraudulent banknotes. And they wanted to give us a sample of one. And the condition of these fraudulent banknotes was don't take them across state lines. Because as you know, if you get caught with a fraudulent banknote across state lines, you'll get in a lot of trouble. So we had access to these banknotes looking fraudulent, and just one of many stories with Gibson over the years.
Yeah, it was a good time. Well, I
You
think
gotta
one
come to cocktail hour now.
Exactly.
You gotta learn the story.
yeah, 3 drinks, I tell everything.
Yeah.
So I think something that'd be helpful for this audience is you've dealt with a lot of different AI projects and you've helped customers and partners succeed. How do you prioritize? So assuming that you were, for the sake of argument, let's say one of the members in the audience is just starting out their AI journey. How do you help them prioritize to get to a meaningful win, something that impacts the business? And we'll have all you answer this question.
So for us, typically when it comes to enterprise, we just kick things off with a POC. So it's a short 90-day POC. There's discovery, trying to understand exactly what the biggest challenge they're facing. What's the MVP kind of like that they can build? So it's kind of tackling each project as like a mini startup. So like internally, these people feel great because they are like, hey, I'm actually building a little mini company within this larger company. And so if you can kind of get them excited about that, they now have much more ownership and they're collaborative and so forth. So a lot of our clients that we work with, we treat it more like a partnership than like trying to close the sale immediately. And so there's been a ton of things that we have done in terms of use cases that I can speak to later on, but that's kind of how we've been tackling it.
I think our customers that do it the best, first, there's 2 different modalities. One is where you're in a deeply entrenched business process that's critical to your business. We find the best way to do that is to educate and empower the experts on how to do AI and let them go figure out what to do because they know the business problem way better. And it's much easier to train on the capabilities of AI than it is to go train on the business problem and domain expertise. And so those experts are going to understand the risks, the needs, et cetera, and with some help can get some augmentation of AI. On the other hand, there's a different modality, which is more the blue sky enterprise transformation. And what we see there is organizations that first build a cross-functional team, so somebody from IT who understands the infrastructure, where the data is located, somebody who has a data science or AI background who understands those tools, and then lines of business or functional leaders coming together to brainstorm, to build the list, and basically building a funnel of AI ideas to AI outcomes where you evaluate, go through a POC and you evaluate the ROI, looking at the cost of the investment and the time and looking at the probable outcome and sorting through that funnel of ideas. So for example, we have a large banking customer in New York who has this sort of structure sponsored by board and CEO level, cross-functional team, I think 6 or 7 lines of business, data science, IT together, 250 projects on the board, that they've done through multiple ideation sessions, and 150 of those are nonsense, terrible ideas that they're culling through quickly to get out of the way so they can go focus on the clear places where there can be great return. So,
Okay, nice. So the question was how to guarantee results, right?
Yeah, how do you prioritize? Because
Yeah.
art of the possible.
Yeah. So first I dropped the word AI from the problem statement. So I'd say like, what is the actual problem you're trying to solve? And then I'd split it into 2 categories. A lot of folks want top line growth. Probably, if you're just starting off on this journey, it's probably not the right place to start. So usually we look for bottom line effectiveness. And the reason for this is the data is usually understood. There's a lot less risk in doing that, and that's a good way of prioritizing, because usually you're optimizing and working through a core set of concepts. The other thing we look at is like what makes a decision proactive and productive. And often when you ask a business, there might be things that the business does that just isn't even aware it does. There's just organizational dynamics. There might be information that they just don't share across the teams. And so we have the perspective, we usually brought in to solve hard, unusual problems. And so you sort of start by saying, what is that and what would make it better? And so we go through and select those specific projects, understanding how do we take some fat out of the system, how do we make it more cost effective, and how do we ensure that we still maintain the right regulatory compliance, data accuracy, and organizational acceptance. And that last little bit I sort of tacked on there, but it turns out that if the team doesn't believe that this is going to work, you're already going to fail. So again, that's why I start by removing the AI piece and focusing on that other portion. The second piece is these systems that you build have to last longer than just one ephemeral delivery. We often build AI to be these one-off projects, and then we try to bring them together. Stop doing that. Instead, think about it as compounding AI. So build an asset that's really good at classifying and looking for fraud. Build an asset that's really good at taking that data and optimizing for best customers. Build those up as compounding assets. And then not only do you have a good set of wins to begin with, each of those wins compounds to a better outcome over time. So that's how we kind of assess it today. The last thing I'll say is every 6 weeks we're taking a step forward. Like just these last few weeks with like Llama Stack and a bunch of other stuff, a bunch of the stuff we're all redoing is now getting unified. So you have to build these use cases so that if you build something, suddenly your competitors can't just do it. So how do you do that? Once again, focus on bottom line first. That'll build up the skills for success. And once you've got those skills, then the top line will start to happen. So that's how we prioritize today and look for success. I think there's still a long road as we define that. And I think also training the organization just how to identify what is good upside and making sure that the organization is pretty committed to that over time. I'll pass it on.
Awesome. Well, these are some amazing pieces of advice. I would just kind of try and complement. What we've seen is two different approaches that have worked both very well. One is a little bit along the lines of what Kamesh mentioned. In the very early days of Verizon, when we established the AI and data organization, we were nobody. I was the first executive on the team. When I left the team, we were 2,000 people. That was the growth over the 5-year period. So in the very beginning was literally, we had no tools, no people. We had to be extremely scrappy. And the name of the game was really about, like Kamesh mentioned, being extremely startup-like, going after specific opportunistic use cases, being almost like an internal McKinsey consultant, dissecting the balance sheet and the income statement of the company and understanding, okay, this is where we might have the might not have the best data, even if we may not have the best data scientists, just the size of the pie is so large that you can go after and make some significant impact. Again, this was several years ago. And that approach works really well if you're in that position where you don't have the resources or you are having to kind of work scrappy. Then it's really about being agile and experimenting quickly. And of course, we used to have a saying, which we coined and we kind of had the whole company repeat after us, path to value. Having a very clear path to value of all the work, because that really helps you deliver the message. The second way of operating, which would be sort of fast forward to when we had established the organization, when we had literally thousands of resources, and then Gen AI came into the fray, and it was this sort of big shift in terms of mindset and almost engagement from the senior leaders. Again, investment was not a problem at that point. Budget was abundant. And so the approach was very different. It was really doubling down and investing into platforms, into people, into everything that you need to kind of orchestrate it as quickly as possible, and then scaling it out as quickly as possible in terms of different use cases. So we lit up 50 Gen AI use cases over the course of a couple of months within the company. And of course, most of those failed, but some of them have now become cornerstone use cases. And the last thing I'll add is, much like Verizon in that sort of later stage, Intu has been investing in data and AI for a very long time. If you're following the company for an investor or just in general, we've been talking about it for the last 5 years. So we're in that sort of modality where it's like the platform's there, the resources are there, everything is there. My job as a product leader is to constantly think about how do I accelerate the rate of learning and the rate of experimentation. How do I get more resources, but mainly focus those resources on as many experiments as possible? Because the simple reality, even today, even after decades of kind of AI work in the books and experts that can kind of speak to, you still don't know what's going to work and what's going to stick, quite candidly. So the reality is you want to get to that answer as quickly as possible. and be willing to kind of make pivots along the way. So even at the scale, the name of the game is still moving fast and experimenting, but it's just you're relying on the scale, you're relying on the platform, the resources, the expertise, maybe go after a more ambitious project or just move with more velocity.
Oh, that's great. So I've got more questions to ask, but this panel is really here for your benefit. Is there anyone that has any questions that have come up? There's no pressure, we'll keep going, but if you have questions, I want to give you the opportunity. Maybe while you're waiting, I'll ask another one. So this question is actually pretty selfish. So I'm curious, pricing. Pricing can be complicated for these AI ML companies that show up. Oftentimes, if you price based on user, you can be taxed. You pushes back on user, and a lot of companies don't like value-based pricing. What are your thoughts about pricing when it comes to AI solutions?
So on our standpoint, pricing is actually very complicated. And
That's a good question then.
It's complicated in the entire industry because when you look at OpenAI, they're always either coming out with a better model or their price is extremely affordable. And so the way we have priced before is on a consumption-based model. So the more documents you analyze using our models, the more we're going to charge you. And it's a price per page, basically. So let's say like 5 cents per page. The issue is that we can lock in customers. So typically when it comes to enterprise customers, they want to have predictable pricing. They don't like to be like, hey, we might use $10 million this year, or this might blow up to like $20 million. So we always have to lock them into an enterprise annual predictable pricing pattern. That's non-negotiable. The issue though is that when it comes to renewal, and you have all these really cool LLMs and Gen AI model that's out there, and those are cheaper, you're like, all right, we have to drop our price because we have to either drop our price or increase the value we're giving the customer because the AI landscape is so competitive right now. It's actually hurting you as an AI company if you're not keeping up with the pace of innovation and the pace of value. Because you cannot build a model and just let it sit there and keep collecting that pay year over year. It's going to diminish. And so our constant thought process right now when it comes to pricing is how do we provide more value every single time to the customer that when it comes to renewal, we're still at that same pricing level or we're higher. And then also figuring out how do we expand within that existing customer so it becomes sticky. But that's been an issue we have seen recently with a lot of these AI models and the competitive pricing.
Yeah. Do you, Rob? Oh.
As we think about building out and maturing AI within our organizations, what sort of vendor partnerships do you think are absolutely required to help kind of incubate and get things going is part one? And then two, if you were on the other side of the table again, how would you evaluate the glut of vendors that come to visit? And who would you, or how would you select somebody to help fill those gaps?
We'll give that one to Thomas.
I'm going to shill for Domino now. I was gonna borrow one of your points on that. I mean, I think. Well, let me start somewhere else. I'll tell you what's terrible. One is putting a capital investment in buying GPU hardware. So I see a lot of customers who have the idea that buying some GPUs are going to imbue them with AI capability. I'd say the second is the scourge of large consulting firms. And when we look at the dollars that are spent on AI today, it's like 40% is going to GPUs and 40% is going to Accenture and Capgemini. And I'm like, I don't know, this doesn't make any sense in the world. So maybe don't do those. I would borrow one point and say, data is critical. And so whoever your data vendor is, or the set of vendors that you have to get your data right, that is still an imperative and still the most important thing that is going to pay massive dividends in terms of the accuracy, predictability of AI in your organization. And so that's absolutely critical. And then, I mean, I don't know, a non-answer is it really depends. We have, there are organizations who are early in the journey and need a tool that is going to help them accelerate quickly from nothing. And there are organizations who are more mature, have embedded business processes where they need update, refresh. That's a different set of vendors and a different set of tools. And then, of course, also on top of that is there's always the interaction with IT and incumbent infrastructure and what's going to match and work well there? Are you a your organization, are you a multinational who needs multiple different clouds and on-premise providers because you've got regulations and risk to deal with, or can you be much more selective and single source vendor sort of thing? So I don't know if that helps, but those are a couple of pieces.
Yeah, I think to build off that, see where we're going to be in like 2 years' time. So most platform providers will have the primitives. They'll have, you watch how many database vendors became vector databases overnight. Turns out it wasn't hard to build a vector database, it's just a different way of embedding. So a lot of the primitives will be on these core platforms. And so part of it is looking at, okay, where do you need to innovate and where do you need to have that dial tone and consistency and where do you have that leverage? So data gravity is important. Where is your data sitting? And then I think it's also important to figure out, okay, what are you biting off first? Where do you need that investment? And what we often find is that it's really important to really think about what that last mile looks like to get activation on that actual innovation you're building. And so you can spend a lot of time building these elegant back-end systems, but have no way to transfer to the front. So looking at that end-to-end is probably a good place to evaluate where you start. With pricing, look, it's changing all the time. We would consider OpenAI expensive. And that is simply because the way we're processing data now, we kind of assume we're going to look at everything. Before we used to really reduce everything down. Now we're doing the reductions, post-model or pre-model. And so we've got we're getting to build very different data patterns. So I guess what I'd say to that is think about what it is you're trying to solve and what that's worth, and figure out the economics of what you're trying to improve. And then back off of that, figure out, okay, what is this innovation going to cost you? And then figure out, okay, how do I break those economics? And that's usually a good framework to making like the alpha decision. And the beta decision, I would say, choose a platform vendor that's likely to have all those primitives in the next 2 years.
I'll just quickly build on what you said and hopefully close the loop. I think this is a vendor agnostic point of view as a customer of many, many different platforms, literally tens of thousands of deployments in terms of users. I would say start with, as Nick said, start with your vision for what problems do you need to solve or want to solve a couple years ahead. Really spend time, adequate time in defining what is your kind of vision or business strategy for how you're going to use AI. That's your first and most important starting point. Data or AI, I guess you could, I think we're here to talk about AI, and then work backwards. Candidly, again, as I said earlier, 5-10 years ago, it was different. You had to really pick and choose vendors. Now, a lot of the hyperscalers, a lot of the platforms like Domino and DataRobot and others have become extremely robust across the spectrum. They're not sort of a single use case tool. They're really a very broad set of use cases platforms. And so I think the choice, in a sense, has become easier in that way, but of course also harder because now you have to really pick and choose between. But again, start with what you're trying to solve and then work your way backwards. Don't ever kind of approach it as, I hear everybody's buying Domino, let me go buy Domino and like that's gonna be my trigger for transformation. Like Thomas pointed out, that doesn't work. You have to start with the value.
In terms of the models, what's the journey between good old predictive versus deep learning versus Gen AI? And the second question is specific to Gen AI, for domain-specific problems, do you see adoption of closed source versus open source?
Can I answer the first part? And
Yep.
then somebody take the second part. I'm a little less experienced in that. We do a survey every year of chief data and analytics officers and look at what they're thinking about technologies and problems in their business and all that sort of thing. And so the view that comes back, and let me just say, I say chief data and analytics officers, like people who are steeped in a long-term view of any type of statistics and model-based decision-making in the business, but also are senior enough to be tasked with a 5 or 10-year vision for their company into the future, right? So what we hear time and time again is they think that Gen AI is going to be 10 to 25% of the technology application within modeling writ large, and they strongly believe that multiple different model types are going to be necessary to serve the business. So there's going to be a mix. And we see that practically applied. We have a large insurance customer who does all their claims processing through a variety of different AI processes. They have Gen AI in that, but it's only a small portion. It's for synopsis of claim reports to put in front of an adjuster if and when there's not an automated process for resolving it. but like 90% of that process is some computer vision to do some matching in the form. It is OCR, it is some statistics, and it is some basically downside modeling for how much they're going to pay out. Like that's their pipeline for the business process of claims resolution. They're putting Gen AI in it, but they're going to have a hybrid of different technologies. And so, yeah, to the first question, that's how we sort of see it.
I'll take the second one. So it turns out that the closed source models, let's just call them big public models, are all going through rapid changes quite frequently. So if you're working in an industry, what industry do you work in? Okay, so you're in a regulated industry. So first of all, you probably shouldn't be pasting data into like a public model like that. So you're probably already in like an open source or your own private instance of those models. The second thing is that you really want to control that data. Once you get to a regulated space or large enough, your own insights, your own data, your own mechanics and the vocab of those models, even if you use a large open source model as the foundation, are really important for the relationships and the distance in that neural network. And what that means sort of in non-techno babble is like, if you don't have a model that's really designed for you, chances are your competitors can do the exact same thing on that public model. The second thing we find is that Google, I was doing some work for a healthcare company and I was working through a maternity drug. They sent me a note saying, hey, we think you're doing something around birth control. If you do anything bad, we'll kick you off of Google for life. And I was like, okay, well, I'm kind of not, but what they told me is one, they're watching their model, and two, they're applying polish to that model. So what if you're doing insurance and you're just doing like, basic reading websites, you happen to go across life insurance, and there's some case about life insurance, and OpenAI decides that they're not going to cover life insurance anymore. Now you've got an entire part of your business that's stuck. And so generally what we see happen is, yes, use these large language models, these frontier models like Llama, like OpenAI, they're great. They actually are very good for doing a lot of good stuff. But when it comes to differentiating and building your own stuff, particularly at the scale I think most folks are operating here, we generally see that you need some level of specific intuition around your own business. And the least risk profile seems to be when you control that model yourself. It's too easy for OpenAI to have an opinion and that opinion to cascade through your business that might affect how it runs. And we see that pretty consistently. Google, even OpenAI on Microsoft has the same issues. Even Llama 3.2 is starting to put some new guardrails in that we're not super stoked about. But overall, you want to have control of those core models, I think. The other thing is that it's looking like at some point these models are going to have to go up in price, or the value exchange is going to have to change differently. So for you to buy Copilot from Microsoft's twice the cost of an E5 license. So you're doubling your price just to get that one feature. Well, you've got 5,000 employees, that's a few $1 million. Well, a few $1 million buys you your own model. Who knows what your employees are putting in that model anyway? You're not capturing it. So you can quickly see how at the scale you're operating in with your own competitive advantage, it does make sense for you to take more ownership of those models. And as the skills get more broadly accepted and understood, you can start to build those skills up inside your own organization, which then equals other innovation. So that's kind of where I'd guide you on that.
I'll quickly build. I know we're almost at time, but I'll quickly build. I think I would caveat in terms of predictive and generative, the split. It depends on the industry, it depends on the company. MailChimp and Intuit is leaning very heavily on generative AI because it is the market, small and medium-sized business, it's marketing. There's so much opportunity for use of generative AI. At Verizon, kind of just to share a little bit of the journey and maybe hopefully that'll be useful. When we sort of started the AI and data organization, we had hundreds of models that were, all the classical sort of classification, regression, and forecasting models, et cetera. And then over time, we ended up completely replacing majority of those with much more sophisticated systems. The key example would be sort of our personalization system that ended up replacing hundreds of models. Think customer churn, propensity to buy. All of these were replaced by a single system that was deep learning based, transformer based, multitask. That's a level of sophistication that not everybody can get to. It requires the investment that we kind of spoke about. So I think it's about determining, how much can you invest? Do you have the talent? And that will kind of guide the path. Back to Intuit, owning TurboTax and QuickBooks, financial LLMs is a really big deal. So I think just to build on that comment, maybe a contrarian view, I think you would develop your own LLM, or you would sort of heavily invest in that space if it makes sense from a business model perspective. But in general,
Are you fine-tuning an open source, or are you building?
no, we're building into this is public information. We have our own proprietary LLM that's really built to power tax use cases and accounting use cases because they're so specialized. OpenAI is not going to do a great job with tax use cases. Trust me, don't trust GPT with tax advice. Anyway, and so, but that made sense for the company. Verizon, it's much harder to make the case to kind of pre-train your own model. So it really depends on the company and the use case.
Any other questions? I'll continue. Just feel free to raise your hand if you have a question. So this is maybe a curveball. One of the panelists, what question would you ask the other panelists? You've got some great brains up here, great experience. If you had a question to ask, what would you ask?
Pricing.
I think one that we all should ask ourselves is like, what big ambitious AI projects failed? And why did they fail? And I think we often get caught in this hype train of like, we're going to build this amazing thing, and you start off with these great ideas. And so my question for everyone here is like, what have been some, pivots and failures you've had, and what advice comes from that we learn as everyone's kind of on this hype train right now as we kind of pull that forward?
I'll tell one.
Yeah.
No, I think that's a great question.
I'll tell a vulnerable one from a product development standpoint. Our product tends to work mostly for domain experts, code-oriented people, so sophisticated users. We built a low-code product to enable more business users. And we ran afoul of two major issues. One is we did this, I think, 3 months before a lot of the generative AI tools came out. And our theory for how to write code was just obliterated by all the in-notebook, in IDE tools, like overnight. And that was sort of terrible. And then we ran afoul of a huge business problem, which is, God, it's just a massively different user base when you think about low-code, non-domain expert users, and trying to put them in the same place was just us taking our eyes off the ball.
Yeah.
So
I've tried to convince.
I don't know what the morals of those are.
Yeah. Well,
Maybe stay focused and beware technology.
Yeah.
I don't know, but
I think it's a great one. Like, I think I've tried to convince analysts that they should become AI experts at many companies. And I think they're very different people. So,
they're very different people. They don't understand statistics.
yeah, but they look good on paper, so you're always like, all right, we're gonna go after those. What about you?
I can't share all the public details, but I will share back to
Maybe the morals and lessons.
Well, I think there was a big project, let's call it that, Project X at Verizon, that garnered massive investment, and we kind of, riding that wave of success, we just thought we were invincible at that point. And I think that hubris is what kind of led us to invest in this really ambitious thing that even we sort of started to publicly talk about, and it on the inside it was just a complete and utter failure in terms of just generating the outcomes that we were really looking to generate. And I think the lesson learned is a lot of what we talked about, which is ground the work in the outcomes and really make sure that you understand what are the different drivers to those outcomes. So there's the technical drivers, there's also the the people drivers, and with that particular project, it was really the people drivers. The technical stuff worked, but the people drivers people were just not interested in kind of adopting this level of sophisticated technology to run their business, to run their process, and so it was just not the right fit.
Yeah, and sometimes for us, or like in general, when you build a product too early and people are not ready for it yet, that can hurt your startup in a very big way. But you might have had the best idea, and you might have built so essentially we built one of this model for financial services, and it was just a little too early in the market. People were just not ready for it yet. And we thought that, hey, this product is a failure because no one wants to buy it. Now fast forward 4 years after we built that product, that specific model, now because of generative AI, everyone is coming to us for that. We kind of just put it on the shelf, and now all of a sudden everyone's coming to us for that. That model was essentially a very fine-tuned classification model that we have built, where a lot of customers, they have millions and millions of news articles, social media data, and so forth, and they have been trying to figure out how can they plug all this data into the RAG-based system and ask questions and get back answers without spending a lot of money. And so what they were like, hey, do you guys have like a classification model that can really filter out all that data and only push the most relevant data into our vector database so we can now call an LLM and ask questions, get back answer. And that model was just sitting on the shelf, and we're like, hey, we can actually save you 80% of your costs right there and increase your accuracy, because now the data that's going into your vector database is much more accurate at the end of the day. So sometimes you build things too early, you might think it's a failure. You just kind of have to ride the wave. The market timing is everything, especially with startup. Someone might build a really cool product, and they might have got a ton of funding, but it just doesn't pick up because the market is just not ready for it. Some of the things we have learned.
And maybe to lean into the failure modes, one of the things I used to like to talk about is there's always tuition. So you've accrued a lot of tuition across your customers, and there's a lot of failure modes that exist with AI. And so maybe what are some of the failure modes that might be more surprising for a group that's deciding to build it from scratch? So I'll share one quickly. Feature drift, a feature drift excursion. If you haven't anticipated that, you can be caught with it. Are there other failure modes that you've run into that might surprise someone who is building from the ground up?
Yeah, you'll have a better name for this than I do. I don't know the categorical name for this, but we had worked with a large retailer, begins with A and ends with N, that built a predictive model for recommendation of products to customers and performed absolutely fantastically when they tested the model and when they shipped it into production. Absolutely failed. And I think the lesson is, I'll say what it did in a second, but I think the lesson is like testing in real life and very quickly building rapid iterations, because they spent a lot of time building a very sophisticated model that did a really good job of predicting things you'd already bought rather than predicting things you'd want to buy next. So
Okay.
Overfitting, yeah, there you go. See, you got it. And so I think that's...
And that brings up the need for rapid iterations, where one of the failure modes is the one time.
Yep.
You build a model and then a year or two later. Any other failure modes from the group? I think that's a great one you brought up.
I think the other one that we see a lot is confusing explicit data with implicit data. And so we've got so much data. We just went through this big data wave. Most of that data is trash, unless you have the implicit system it worked in. And so part of that means it's good because people can't just take your data and apply it to the model and get the same insights. But understanding that implicit systems that surround your data is actually where we find a lot of the alpha. I'll give you a healthcare example. So we look at surveillance for ER to identify people that might have potential heart valve failure. If you're diagnosed with a heart valve failure, you've pretty much got to get a live. The clock starts ticking. And if you think about how you move through that system, you go to a cardiologist, you get a echocardiogram, you then go to a cardiologist, you might get a valve transplant. It could take weeks, and a lot of time you go to the ER, you're like, oh, I feel real out of breath after that run. Like, oh, it's just, you just had a stomach bug. And you go home. You come back 6 weeks, you're like, oh, I'm feeling a little under the weather. You go home. That clock started 12 weeks ago. And so if you don't understand the implicit data around what's happening about the different flows, you might not be able to identify that really important feature of this person has a valve failure. So even though the data might exist, you have to look at the system it exists in. And so often the failure mode is, how do we solve for this problem and like what's actually happening around this data? And then you end up with these overfit scenarios where you built this model that's supposed to solve these problems, but it forgot that, Barbara turns the lights out on Tuesday, so there's going to be no one buying stuff on Tuesdays. And so those are some of the things I think we come across today that really folks forget about, but also can break things, but also be really valuable.
Yeah, another thing too is for us, it's a niche problem, but it's building a point-in-time system. It comes to asset management or trading, because like, for example, Facebook changed its name to Meta. And if you want to now go and get 10 years of historical data on Meta or Facebook, you would basically have to look at both names itself. And when it comes to trading, like you need to now backtest this data to figure out, all right, am I trading Facebook, FB, or am I trading Meta? So like, it's a niche problem, but it's a very, very big one when it comes to hedge funds. It's really building up a point-in-time system to make sure that, all right, Facebook was mentioned in this point of the time of the data set, and Meta, that it then got changed to Meta in this point of the time. It's extremely, extremely critical, and if you don't have that, no one's going to purchase your data when it comes to hedge funds, but it's also a niche problem that we've seen.
Okay. Well, we're at time, so now I'm going to ask my hardest question. It might take some time for you guys to chew on it. You have seasoned executives in the room. They've just spent 2 days going deep on, I would argue they were very qualified before, and now we've gone even deeper on delivering value, coming up with strategy, talking about failure modes. And so a lot of the typical advice that you give with strategy, which is profound, which is useful and helpful, what big idea or new idea can you share with them that you don't think they've heard yet? So I think there's a lot of classical things that people say that are useful and helpful. So what would be a new idea or a different idea that you think you could share with this group that maybe hasn't been discussed? And I know that's a hard question. Like I would hate for the same question to be coming my way.
You gonna take it first?
I'll start, but again, given the audience, you may have sort of heard of this one. I think it's a really prime opportunity to explore these agentic workflows using AI. But the advice I would give there is avoid the typical mistake of looking at your process and sort of trying to replace a part or enhance a certain part, but rather, really push yourself to the limit and think about what if I truly did this end to end using technology, right? No people, full automation. It's kind of a hard exercise, to be honest, to go through and to really, because you start going into the probabilities and you're like, oh, well, it might fail here and it might fail there. And it's like, oh, that's too much risk. I can't take on that risk. But the advice I have is don't think about the risk. You're doing this for the purposes of learning. You're doing this for the purposes of exploring these new technologies. And I'm just gonna say, you'll be really surprised how some of these end-to-end workflows and kind of full use cases can just now be solved entirely with technology. And the risk and sort of the margin, if you will, of error is getting smaller and smaller by the day. So you can see the light at the end of the tunnel when that's it. It's gonna be a production process. So that's one that I would highly sort of recommend. It's bold, but if you get there faster than anybody else in your industry, then you might get to reap the rewards.
I like that. You said the bar high, Alec.
Another one that I'm always thinking about is how to be cost effective when it comes to using AI or not even AI, building anything itself. Like, for example, we wanted to build a specific feature for one of our product, and our development team were like, hey, this is going to cost $1 million. But then I went and asked a few other different teams and people and so forth, and we kind of just brainstormed together, and all of a sudden, after 6 weeks of hard brainstorming work, we got that $1 million down to $50K. So it's really looking at how can you really be cost effective with AI, especially with everything that's out there right now. You can really build a startup from scratch with $100K investment. You don't need to raise millions and millions of dollars anymore. Previously, you need to do that. I have a lot of friends that literally are not taking venture capital anymore because the price of building a startup is so low that they can just get $100K, build a startup, get revenues immediately within 4 months or 5 months, and be profitable. The world has changed, especially with startups, and we're seeing a lot of that shift.
I'm not sure this will be massively insightful, but it's something I've been thinking about and toying with for the past couple of weeks. I think there's a massive bifurcation in the application of AI between what is end user compute and what is core business processes. And why is that important? A couple of reasons. One, when looking, and let me define what I mean by end user compute. In that bucket, I put the co-pilots and the open AIs and the getting your talent using tools that makes them more efficient and effective, and then contrast with
consumer-oriented use cases.
Yeah, and consumer, but like your workforce oriented, right? And I think the bifurcation is really important because these are just very different business applications of AI. And when you think about the ROI of getting the right enablement for your workforce, I think Henry talked about using images and communicating better. We have a large consulting firm who wants to get 10,000 people effectively using tools and secretly wants to reduce the number of people they have to do that. That's a radically different problem than trying to embed AI in a core insurance business process. And if you're really trying to maximize value, these are just totally different domains to think about. The costs are different, the application is different, the risk is different because maybe you have some security risk over here and over here you have regulatory risk, and it's just radically different. And so bifurcate your problems and then think about them with different evaluation.
Yeah, great.
So I'll build up that a little bit. So first of all, most CEOs don't care about productivity. You go, what do you mean? Of course they do. So here's the thing, they're already paying for that stuff. They should already be 100% more effective. So why are they paying twice as much for them to now use a GPT to do their homework? Yes, they're happier, but if you talk to a lot of CEOs today, they're like, well, we haven't seen this massive performance bottom line impact. So let me flip the script a little bit. How much do you think you spend on SAP, Salesforce, these massive data systems, right? Well, if you kind of play this modality forward, soon you won't need those systems. Or all the interfaces, integrations, all those craplets, all those multiple years of systems that get built up, those might go away completely. We have agentic workflows that dynamically join two APIs together. So we say, we need these two data sources, we set it off the API, it reads the open API JSON file, it builds the connector, writes a description, plumbs into the system. Day later, pretty much 10 lines of code, a description of what we want, and these APIs are plugged in. And then it effectively builds the validation schemas, the testing, the whole lot. So most folks take weeks to onboard new data sets. We're off now just discovering new ones. So we actually sniff for open API JSON files and like, well, that looks interesting. That's relevant to my audience, and we'll plumb in the API. So the way that backend systems will evolve and the way that we expect to pay for them will dramatically change. And all these vendors are rapidly shifting around trying to tell you that they have an authoritative schema, and that was once true. It was true you had to have an oil and gas schema or insurance schema, but that schema's been your controlling boundary for a very long time. I don't know how much you'd spend on IT costs to maintain that schema, but what if that dramatically started to change? And so I think, are there needs for source of truth systems? Sure. But all the stuff that sits in the middle that we spend probably millions, if not billions, if not trillions of dollars globally on every year could just totally go away. And that's, to a CEO, is going to be worth a lot more than me having been able to send in my homework a little faster. And so I think, to give you an idea of where this could be going, that whole back-end infrastructure, as you said, is about to dramatically change, I think.
Yeah. Well, fantastic. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you, guys.